Professor Kenneth Valpey. The title of his talk is God as the Supreme Teacher, Swami Prabhupada's Modern Gaudiya Vaishnava Mission to Reveal the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So Kenneth Valpey is a research fellow at the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and a research fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He's the co-director of the Bhagavata Purana Research Project. He has co-edited a volume of articles and translated a volume of selections from the Bhagavata Purana. Both volumes were published by Columbia University Press. He has recently published a monograph on animal ethics entitled Called Care in Hindu Animal Ethics. He has taught courses on Indian religion and culture at the University of Florida, Gainesville, Chinese University of Hong Kong, and the University of Pula, Croatia. He's a practitioner of Vaishnava Hindu devotional yoga since 1972. So please, Kenneth Valpey, Krishna Kshetra Swami, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you, Alan, also, both of you, for inviting me to take part in this project, which is, it's really, I think, a very important project because it's going to be instrumental in putting Vaishnava discussion of God on the map of philosophy of religion. So I think this is a very good thing. I was kind of under the impression that we should come to this prepared with a first draft of what we would be putting in the book. And so if you don't mind, I'm going to be reading, but I do have some slides with quotes, occasional quotes. So if I can share the screen, I would like to do that. Yeah. Okay. But first, some introductory comments. A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, 1896 to 1977, was a prominent contemporary exponent of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, known for successfully expanding a worldwide mission of what he called Krishna consciousness, which he formalized as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness in 1966. Swami Prabhupada identified himself as an authorized and faithful member of a disciplic succession of the Gaudiya Vaishnava lineage, and regarded himself as strictly adhering to and conveying the teachings of his predecessors as what he called a transparent via medium. Yet there are noteworthy features of his particular presentation of Gaudiya Vaishnava theology and practice that deserve our attention in the context of this conference's aim, namely to articulate the several shades of theological reflection on the nature of God found in Vaishnava traditions. In particular, I want to suggest that Swami Prabhupada put special emphasis on the idea of God as teacher, indeed as the supreme teacher, worthy of being regarded as a key attribute of God, particularly as Krishna, and more specifically as speaker of what would become known as the Bhagavad Gita. It may be argued that God as teacher is an attribute already recognizable in Gaudiya and other Vaishnava traditions. Yet Prabhupada's particular ways, partly stylistic but also substantive, of presenting and enacting this attribute may serve to enrich not only our understanding of the Gaudiya and possibly other Vaishnava conceptions of God, it may also facilitate an enrichment of and specification of what the philosopher of religion Robert Neville and his colleagues identify as a fuzzy category for comparing religious ideas, namely the category religious truth under three subheadings, namely propositional truth, performative truth, and embodied truth. To these ends, I will give attention to three key English expressions used extensively by Prabhupada, namely, quote, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his translation of Bhagavan, the Sanskrit term, devotional service, his main translation of the term bhakti, and Krishna consciousness, his translation of Krishna Bhavanamrita. Parenthetically, these three expressions can be related to three traditional Gaudiya theological categories, namely Sambandha or Sambandha Jnana, Abhideya, and Prayojana. So I'll structure this presentation somewhat loosely around Prabhupada's three expressions to argue that conceiving God as Supreme Teacher is an important key to his understanding of God as Krishna. So we start with propositional truth. This quote will come up in a minute. To get a sense of how Swami Prabhupada's identification of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead is significant for qualifying Krishna as the Supreme Teacher, let's begin with an extract from near the beginning of Prabhupada's introduction to his Gita translation and commentary, Bhagavad Gita as it is. And I quote, "The speaker of Bhagavad Gita is Lord Shri Krishna. He is mentioned on every page of Bhagavad Gita as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bhagavan. Of course, the word Bhagavan sometimes refers to any powerful person or any powerful demigod. And certainly here, Bhagavan designates Lord Shri Krishna as a great personality. But at the same time, we should know that Lord Shri Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, as is confirmed by all great acharyas like Shankaracharya, Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, Nimbarka Swami, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and many other authorities of Vedic knowledge in India. Here, Prabhupada appeals to the authority of several Vaishnava teachers and even to the Advaita Vedanta school's preeminent Shankaracharya. And he also indicates further on in his Gita introduction that Krishna is identified explicitly as Bhagavan in post-Vedic texts other than the Bhagavad Gita. For Prabhupada, these references are sufficient to establish Krishna incontrovertibly as the Supreme Being, from which he then derives the conclusion that Krishna's words in the Gita are supremely authoritative. Implied here and elsewhere made more explicit, Swami Prabhupada takes as objective historical truth Krishna's claim in the Gita that he speaks to Arjuna the same teaching that he had spoken in ancient times to a particular celestial superhuman being, the Lord of the Sun, Vivasvan. Being the same teaching given by the same person who is identified as the Supreme Person, implied is that the teaching is both faultless and accessible. Also implied in Prabhupada's Gita introduction is the claim that because the term Bhagavan is omniscient, his position as supreme knower affirms his authority to teach. Indeed, Prabhupada identifies Krishna as the supreme teacher of the world early in his Gita commentary. As an omniscient teacher possessing ultimate authority over the content of his teaching, and since the core content of his teaching is about God himself, it becomes particularly necessary to recognize, according to Swami Prabhupada, that God is ultimately and essentially a person. Hence, the expression Supreme Personality of Godhead serves to encapsulate both the identity of this Supreme Teacher, Krishna, as well as the core content of his teaching, namely that God, Krishna, is to be understood as a person, specifically as the Supreme Person or primordial person. Further, for Swami Prabhupada, the scope of God's knowledge, being unlimited, must include having perfect and complete knowledge of how to convey knowledge of himself to humans, such that humans can comprehend and imbibe this knowledge. Such teaching know-how, how to transfer knowledge of himself, of God, is, according to Prabhupada, done first and foremost through a process of explicit verbal instruction by Krishna, complemented by conscious, intentional, verbal, oral learning on the part of humans who undertake the effort to hear and understand God. What I've so far noted regarding Swami Prabhupada's identifying God as Krishna and Krishna as the Supreme Teacher can all be characterized in terms of propositional truth, which Neville and colleagues highlight as having error as its opposite. I think I have a slide to say this. Yes. Swami Prabhupada's logic in making this identification is rooted in his literalist interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, whereby Krishna is taken to have literally appeared in the world in a historical context, in a geographically identifiable place in ancient India. Literalism may be understood as simple acceptance of Krishna's words in the Bhagavad Gita as having been truly spoken by him, who speaks truly, without error, about himself. It is an approach by which any trace of a hermeneutics of suspicion is entirely absent. For Swami Prabhupada, literal reading of the Gita secures and honors the notion that because God is omnipotent, he is fully able to and does communicate effectively and faultlessly, which is to say, without error. And he accomplishes such error-free communication despite, or indeed because, he is present in the phenomenal world when he speaks the Gita. In his Gita commentary, Swami Prabhupada uses the phrase perfect knowledge 36 times, identifying thereby the quality of the knowledge taught by Krishna as perfect, or else he shows confidence that it is perfectly possible for human beings to receive or become situated in perfect knowledge. So now I'll proceed to discuss performative truth, devotional service, the opposite of which is deceit. What Swami Prabhupada emphasizes is what we might call divine personal specificity, which could be expressed in the form of a question, namely, quote, among all possible candidates for the position of God, who is God truly? Unquote. A question that Prabhupada answers with such assertions as perfect knowledge of the absolute truth means perfect knowledge of Krishna. While certainly aligned with Gaudiya Vaishnava epistemology, which privileges Shabda Praman from a specified divine personal source, contra the Mimamsa insistence on absolute aporusheyatva of Shabda Praman, Swami Prabhupada arguably goes a step further by translating Bhagavan as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He highlights God's agency and intentionality in his role as Supreme Teacher. Thus, God is not only the supreme preceptor, he is also the supreme performer, enactor, or initiator of teacher-student relationality. As Swami Prabhupada notes, perhaps echoing and extending Ramanuja, the living entities are always subordinate to the Supreme Lord, as in the case of the master and the servant, or the teacher and the taught. And what sort of performance is being enacted? Yoga. Both the Lord as Yogeshvara and the Jiva enact yoga, the fruit of which is the linking of Yogeshvara and the Jiva. Both are yogis in a relation of yoga teacher and yoga student. This brings us to the second of Neville and colleagues' categories of religious truth, namely performative truth, which has as its opposite deceit. Since Krishna is identified as Bhagavan, suggesting omnibenevolence as well as omniscience and omnipotence, and since those, beginning with Arjuna, who seek to comprehend his teachings, are said to find his teachings to be true, Krishna's appearance in the world is regarded by Swami Prabhupada as the perfect performance of truth, free from all deception. For Swami Prabhupada, the performative truth of Bhagavan Shri Krishna's enactment of yoga as Yogeshvara, by appearing directly in the world and directly speaking his teachings, crucially centers on teaching the jivas, represented especially by Arjuna in the Gita, teaching the jivas a process, a practice, a performance, how to connect permanently with him, Krishna, by performing specifically and centrally bhakti yoga. Whereas bhakti is often translated in English with the word devotion, Prabhupada most often wrote and spoke of devotional service, which he frequently referred to as that which devotees perform. Further, he identifies or equates devotional service with the Lord, thereby equating this activity as performative truth with the performative truth of Krishna's teaching about himself. For example, he says, devotional service is a process of spiritual understanding. Whereas devotional service exists, the material contamination cannot coexist. Wherever it exists. Devotional service to the Lord and the Lord himself are one and the same because they are spiritual. And he says further, this is in a lecture, one of his early lectures. We should find out what will please Krishna, and we should do that. How can we know what will please Krishna? By hearing Bhagavad Gita and taking the right interpretation from the right person. Then we'll know what Krishna wants, and we can act accordingly. At that time, we will be elevated to first-class devotional service. To act accordingly is for Prabhupada to perform devotional service in such a way as will please Krishna. Thus, pleasing Krishna is the goal of the performance, but it is also the test of its authenticity. It is performative truth free from deception. Bhakti as devotional service implies active engagement, whereby physical embodiment can be understood as I would call it a bodying forth of the devotee student in concert with the divine teacher. Yet such bodying forth occurs, as already implied, in two directions, from above by the supreme teacher and from below by the devotee student. As Prabhupada repeatedly emphasized, how these two are connected is through the chain of disciplic succession, quote unquote. Of course, the notion of Guru Parampara, disciplic succession, is common to all Vaishnava traditions. including the Gaudiya tradition. What is to be noted as distinctive in Swami Prabhupada's presentation is his emphasis on the, quote, right interpretation by the right person, unquote. Where the right interpretation is a literal one, the right person doing the interpreting is clearly one who interprets the teaching literally. And we go to the third and last section, embodied truth, Krishna consciousness. The expected result of this bi-directional practice of yoga by Krishna and by the devotee of Krishna is what Swami Prabhupada referred to countless times as Krishna consciousness. In one early lecture, Prabhupada said, nonetheless, while there is no possibility of experimental knowledge about Krishna, if one becomes advanced in Krishna consciousness, he will realize God directly. For example, through realization, I am firmly convinced of whatever I am saying here about Krishna. I am not speaking blindly. Similarly, anyone can realize God. Swayameva spuratyada. Direct knowledge of God will be revealed to anyone who sticks to the process of Krishna consciousness. Such a person will actually understand, yes, there is a spiritual kingdom where God resides, and I have to go there. I must prepare to go there. Before going to another country, one may hear so much about it, but when he actually goes there, he understands everything directly. Similarly, if one takes up the process of Krishna consciousness, one day he'll understand God and the kingdom of God directly, and the whole problem of his life will be solved. Throughout his Gita commentary, Prabhupada emphasizes that Krishna consciousness is yoga, and that Krishna is actively involved, helping a jiva yogi to achieve permanent success in yoga. He writes, Krishna's devotees' only desire is to achieve the association of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Such a devotee undoubtedly approaches the Lord without difficulty. This is called yoga. The Lord helps the devotee to achieve Krishna consciousness by yoga. And when he becomes fully Krishna conscious, the Lord protects him from falling down to a miserable condition of life. Here, the point is that for Swami Prabhupada, the expression Krishna consciousness can be understood as indicating the third of Neville's three subcategories of religious truth, namely embodied truth. The opposite of embodied truth is failure, which is to say that the sort of truth in question is embodied in practice in the constant engagement in devotional service to the point of, as Prabhupada says, quote, unquote, understanding everything directly. This idea that one can understand everything directly brings us back to our starting point. Namely, Swami Prabhupada's translation of the Sanskrit term Bhagavan as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Thus, everything in this case means to understand God to be a specific person, namely Krishna, and this knowledge is direct in a way similar to how we all directly know any other person. And a few concluding, coming up in a minute, some concluding thoughts. Oh, I put in the wrong order. Yeah. Swami Prabhupada did not regard himself as a theologian or a philosopher so much as a missionizing servant of his direct teacher, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. As such, he regarded himself as performing the function of a transparent via medium of teachings that he regarded as being faithfully transmitted from Krishna, especially as inscribed in the Bhagavad Gita, comprehended literally as having been spoken on a battlefield in what is now North India. Regarding Krishna as the ultimate and unique omniscient Lord, Prabhupada deemed Krishna to be the supreme teacher, whose process of teaching as the Lord of Yoga was perfectly capable and effective for bringing about direct personal knowledge of Krishna, a knowledge deemed the perfection of yoga. Such perfectional knowledge was to be understood, indeed lived experientially through purified senses, quote unquote, through performance of devotional service, again in quotes, by which the Supreme Personality of Godhead would become known as he is, again in quotes. A transformative sort of knowing in that the practitioner becomes an active participant in the process of teaching and learning. First as a learner and then as a teacher, a transparent via medium for the Supreme Teacher. And now back to, as Paul Carney writes in the context of discussing the Valpey Vaishnava tradition, for the devotees of Krishna, that most colorful of all Hindu deities, ultimate truth is not a remote, nebulous abstraction consigned solely to the realm of philosophical speculation, nor is it something bound up with theological dogma and imposed from above. Rather, it is constantly affirmed as an immediate reality to be validated by ordinary devotees themselves through direct perception. This same idea could be well attributed to Swami Prabhupada, who many times spoke strongly of the limitations and even futility of philosophical speculation about the Supreme. By insisting on a literal reading of the Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada charted a process of teaching and learning Krishna consciousness that, he insisted, is thoroughly grounded in the recognition of Krishna as the supreme teacher of what Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita refers to as the king of knowledge, Raja Vidya. Yet, and this is my final point, yet Swami Prabhupada's literalism, maybe we want to call it abundant literalism following Graham Oppy, begs acknowledgement as being highly resistant to our modern and postmodern sensibilities. Is it not, we wonder, a classic example of circular reasoning, since Krishna himself makes the claim of being the supreme being, and those who accept his authority base it on his own claim? Or, alternatively, is his literalism a challenge to and a way of breaking out from what anthropologist Susan Greenwood calls rationalism's hall of mirrors? Can the rationalism demanded in determining propositional truth even determine which of these alternatives applies? Could it be rather that the performative and embodied dimensions of truth do well to be included in the calculus of religious truth's validation? And I leave with that question. I end with that question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting talk. So we have time for discussion. So questions? Okay, so Alan has a question, and after him, I think I would like to ask a question. So go ahead, Alan.
I'll mute myself. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. That was really actually interesting, the way you kind of like expressed that and explained it. I never really thought of it that way. So we have, I mean, let me try to get this, try to figure out. So we have a concept of God basically is framed through tattva, or basically the teaching attribute, God in as much as he teaches in a sense. And that's done in terms of the anubandhas, those the sambandha, abhidhya, and prayojana, which are the three. And you've kind of linked them in with proposition and performance and embodiment and body truth, these three types of truths. And as much as I think the way they fit in better is through, I think, the later Gaudiya, like I think Krishnadas Kaviraj deals with it more like theology and practice and that type of thing, rather than being hermeneutic categories. And in this way, the idea of God is something that is embodied in all these different attributes that come out of a teacher type of thing. Is that getting in the direction where you were going? Is that something, or am I completely off key?
Well, possibly, but I just want to sort of draw back from sort of the focus that I think tends to be there in our deliberations on what would be called propositional truth, and therefore identifying God as supreme teacher. Yes, it's taking, you can say, speaking in propositional terms, God is supreme teacher, but then what are the implications of that? They're leading sort of straight out of the realm of proposition to his performance and what Neville is calling embodiment, and this importance of the process. A supreme teacher should be a really good teacher, should be an effective teacher, should be one who can really get across whatever he or she is teaching. So I think the idea here is just that for Swami Prabhupada, Krishna demonstrates that to the best way known, or to the greatest extent known, if you like, and he does focus very much on the Bhagavad Gita as sort of the model of teaching, but of course he also refers to Bhagavata Purana and so on. But yeah, that's kind of how I'm trying to take it.
That's very interesting. Thanks. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to ask a question. Well, that's in fact a very interesting idea, if understood well, to consider God as a supreme teacher, as a kind of attribute of God. So if this is right, and if we consider that every attribute that God has, he has it essentially, not accidentally, he must have that attribute. So just an implication that came to my head, that in order to be a teacher, of course, you need students, right? And it seems that the kind of knowledge that you are considering is basically the knowledge that leads someone towards liberation. So if you need students, you need people who are conditioned, and they are in this so-called material world, right? So then, in order, I hope I'll be clear enough. So in order for God to be the supreme teacher, he needs like a creation. He needs this material realm. So in this sense, this material realm should be there. So some philosophers, they see a problem with that. They don't speak about material realm, they speak about creation. They see a problem with that they think that if God, he has to create a world, then he's not completely free. He has this obligation. I know that this goes a little bit, too far. But how would you respond to that?
Okay, it's very interesting to your reasoning. I'm always shuddering at your powers of logic, Ricardo. But I think there's a presupposition there, which the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, more broadly, not just Swami Prabhupada, would argue. Jiva Goswami, I believe, would argue that God is also teacher in the transcendent realm. And that could be, there would be examples of that in the Bhagavata Purana. He's teaching the gopis, And so from that perspective, I think the idea that he has to therefore have a material world in order to have students because they have to be conditioned so that he can teach them liberation, I think gets undermined by that. But what it does highlight, I think, yes, to be a teacher, you need students. And that highlights the notion that if we take his being a teacher as an essential attribute, that there is fundamentally a distinction between God and creatures, God and the jivas, and indeed, this is how this is one way of highlighting that distinction, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. So Christopher has a question, but I think that Professor Varakedi, he wanted to ask something. Am I wrong, Professor Varakedi?
Yes, yeah, it was a very lucid presentation. I liked it. So I would like to ask a simple question. So Prabhupada follows Acharya Madhva in many of his tenets. But at one point he differs that Lord Krishna, the form of Krishna, is Supreme Being. And my question is, what made him to differ from the tradition of Madhva? And then the other question is, if so, the other forms of God are inferior to Krishna? This is the question.
Okay. Very interesting question coming from your good self as a scholar of Madhva Vedanta. I'm very challenged. You've asked in a very polite way. Let me just say that's a big subject, but as I mentioned, Swami Prabhupada saw himself as a follower of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. That line goes back to Sri Chaitanya. And well, before rather after Sri Chaitanya is Baladeva Vidyabhushana. And then before Chaitanya, there is Ishvara Puri, and then there's Madhavendra Puri. Now, within the Gaudiya tradition, there's a claim that Madhavendra Puri was a disciple, was a member of the Madhva Sampradaya, to which, of course, you will say, what do you mean by having a sannyasi with the name Puri? All our sannyasis have the name Tirtha. So there we get into some murky history, but also theologically, a lot of scholarship has been done on this point, that while there is considerable overlap or acceptance of Madhva, and I don't have it at the tip of my mind, the details of this at present, but that there are also considerable points of connection with the Sri Vaisnava Sampradaya. So there's a tension there of acceptance, non-acceptance, and as far as regard of other forms of divinity, Narayana, Vishnu, and so on, there's a kind of understanding that there is equality and there is also difference. So one of the most important acharyas of the Gaudiya line is Rupa Goswami. And he wants to identify Krishna as superior in the sense that he has 4 specific qualities, gunas, which all other forms of Vishnu do not exhibit. But again, that's a longer discussion. It mainly has to do with the importance of rasa and understanding relation with God in terms of rasa. I hope that gives some indication.
I'm sorry. So Christopher, please, your turn.
Thank you. Yes, no, actually, Ricardo, I was just going to reply or just throw in a 2 cents following up on your question about necessity and the problem of the appearance that God needs students or needs the offerings at a temple and so on. And of course, the construct that's most often invoked there is lila or play, as most people here, I think, would agree, a very central concept. When we think of baby Krishna dancing with the gopis, there are these very explicit modes of play in the life of Krishna, but also theologically, it's very important to have as a reference when one says, well, he appears to need to do this, or he appears to act out of necessity to do this or that, but actually it's just all lila. And so wherever it seems that God is acting on a kind of a compulsion or seeking to cause something that is, he might think he could snap his fingers and bring about, this concept lila is always ready at hand, as a reference to, I don't know if you find it, philosophically convincing necessarily, but it is a construct that's invoked fairly often in that context.
No, sure. I think everything. What is at stake here is whether or not the God's attributes they are essential. Because a lila, something that he does in a lila is up to him, right? Is accidental, we might say. So if his property, we might say, as a teacher, is also a lila, so he doesn't possess that property necessarily. Is accidental. So I think the whole thing is whether or not we consider his properties essential or accidental. Some people would say that God doesn't have any accidental property. All of God's properties are essential, but that's another issue. Okay, now Juan Diego, please.
Okay, I had some troubles with my connection here, so I hope that this works. My question is more like a commentary and a related question. Is that the concept that Swami is developing about this embodied truth? I think it would be nice, very good to relate it with the kind of philosophy of mind that is developing in the recent decades, in the idea of embodied mind, extended mind, and ecological mind. And also some years ago, we have the development of the standard knowledge. And also in this connection, I have wrote a paper entitled The Ecology of Religious Knowledges, and that appears in the Journal of Religions in this year, in 2022, that covers this kind of issues. And I think that is very interesting to go deep in this understanding.
Thank you. That sounds interesting. If somehow I could get a copy of your paper, that would be nice.
Of philosophy as a way of life that comes from Greek, ancient Greek, and
yeah.
But my question will be that if you are acquainted with that literature and this kind of discussions, and also whether this kind of epistemology, let us say, invariant epistemology, is connected with
connection is not the best.
Juan, we lost you.
Yeah.
So perhaps you can email your question to
yeah. I think I got the essential thing. He's brought up a nice point. He was asking whether I'm familiar with
okay,
that literature.
So I will leave my comment out.
Whoops.
But he's answering.
So I'm just saying I'm only very minimally familiar with it. I know personally one scholar who's quite engaged with it, but I would be very thankful if I could receive your paper, the one that you mentioned, Juan. This could help to formulate some connection with that discourse. Thank you.
Okay. So I think our time is up. But as Krishna Kshetra Swami, go ahead.
Well, it's not a question, and I wanted to address Christopher Austin, but I think he's left already. But I just felt a need to sort of salvage the term Leela, because he was kind of bringing it up that Leela is this typical Vaishnava afterthought, to sort of explain so many things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's possible, and you'd probably be better at this than me, Ricardo, but to see how Leela is a necessity rather than an accident. What comes to my mind is that it's a necessity because the alternative would be a God who is subject to the reactions of action. So karma, we understand, brings, I think this is true of all the Vaishnava traditions and far beyond, the idea that karma is always bringing about some sort of what we call reaction, and the opposite of that. One way of understanding Leela is it's just not that. Leela is action without reaction. It is the way God acts. If we understand that God is omnipotent, that means he is capable of acting, but that acting has to be in the form of Leela. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But because I think there are perhaps two levels here. The first one is whether or not Leela has to take place. I mean, that's all right. But the other level perhaps are the details of the Leela. I mean, the actions that Krishna, that the gopis, the actions that they actually make. So if this second level, we think that they are necessary, Krishna has to act like this, he has to act like that within the Leela, then perhaps it's not Leela anymore. You see what I mean?
Because he's impelled from outside, so to speak.
Yeah, he's not free anymore to act as he will.
Yeah, that gets into the realm of understanding bhakti in terms of how God sort of intentionally subordinates himself to the will of his devotee, where yes, he is impelled, he is in a sense forced, but his force is ultimately under his control.
He allows it. That's different.
Yeah.
Right?
He allows himself to be controlled, as a parent allows his child to, roughhouse with him and so on.
Yeah, amazing topic.
I just wanted to salvage. I felt like we kind of let the notion of Leela get dismissed a bit too easily.
So go ahead, Alan.
No, I was agreeing with you. I was thinking about the idea of within even that Leela, you have the idea of sort of sattva and all that stuff. The different entities that are engaging in that Leela, and so you have all them connected by Shakti, and Shakti Mat, and then you also have the idea that Leela, in a sense, is necessary if God is acting. If God is acting, then He has to act in a certain way, and therefore that acting in a certain way is through something that's called Leela, right? So if you think that God is simple substances, unacting and non-acting, then you have a problem. But if God has an aspect that is acting, then there you have Leela.
You're right. You're right.
So,
You're right. Yeah, that's the point.
Anyway.
Okay, so I'm afraid we have to end. And this was a quite long session. Thank you for your patience. Tomorrow we are going to have a shorter session. Again, only 3 talks. The first one will be by Vijay Ramnarase. He's going to talk about the Nimbarka Sampradaya, the concept of God in the Nimbarka Sampradaya. Then we are going to have Frederick Smith. He's going to speak about God in Postimarga. And then finally, Alan was going to speak about the Chaitanya Vaishnava tradition. So we hope to see you again tomorrow. Yeah, so thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Sri Acharya. Thank you for your amazing talk. Bye-bye.